The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone as Katie Rodriguez moved through Sacred Heart's pediatric wing at 11:38 p.m., a fresh set of patient charts pressed against her chest like armor. 3 weeks. 21 days since she'd walked into this hospital with a carefully constructed resume and a fabricated nursing school transcript, and already the weight of the lie was settling into her shoulders like a second skin. She'd carried wounded men twice her size through the streets of Ramadi under fire. She'd held a bleeding Marine's intestines in her hands while calling coordinates for a medevac. She could start and fall on a dehydrated toddler without a second thought. But she couldn't let anyone see that. Not here. Not at Sacred Heart in San Diego, where Dr. Sterling was already watching her with the kind of smile that came right before a predator moved. The thing nobody understood about hiding in plain sight was that it required a specific kind of emptiness. Katie had learned this in 2019, after the Fallujah operation went black. After the hospital bombing that killed 14 people and officially killed her. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had ceased to exist that day, erased from every naval database, every deployment roster, every record except the ones locked in a Pentagon file cabinet on the 3rd floor of the building that didn't officially exist. The Navy had given her a new Social Security number, a new driver's license, and a written order to disappear. What they hadn't given her was the ability to stop being what she was. That didn't fade. That didn't go away. It just learned to keep its head down. She moved through the hallway with the kind of efficiency that made other nurses stare without quite knowing why. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Her footsteps were controlled, her breathing steady, her eyes tracking exits and entry points the way they always did. 12 years of muscle memory didn't just vanish because she'd traded her dress uniform for hospital scrubs. It didn't vanish because her Navy Cross was packed in a waterproof box at the bottom of her apartment closet, wedged between old deployment photos and a Purple Heart she couldn't bring herself to look at. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. The hands remembered. The lungs remembered the specific smell of battlefield medicine, copper blood, diesel exhaust, the acrid sting of cordite mixing with antiseptic. Sacred Heart smelled like bleach and stale coffee and something else. Something sanitized. Safe. It made her want to scream. In the staff lounge near the nurses' station, Dr. Sterling was holding court, his tailored white coat pristine, his smile sharp as a scalpel. She'd noticed him the first day, the way his eyes lingered on her just a beat too long, assessing her like she was a problem to solve. He had that particular kind of confidence that came from never being challenged, never being told no. Old money. Ivy League. The kind of doctor who'd never lost a patient because he'd never actually had to work that hard. His voice carried that condescending drawl that made every word feel like an insult disguised as concern. These nursing school babies never last, he was saying to the other physicians clustered around the break room table, his eyes finding Katie as she passed the doorway. I'll give this one until the end of the month. My money says she quits before the month is out. $50. His colleagues chuckled, the kind of laughter that was less amusement and more permission. Permission to dismiss her. Permission to not take her seriously. Permission to make her someone's punchline. Katie kept moving. Didn't slow. Didn't look back. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pure, muscle-burning restraint, the kind that came from knowing exactly how easy it would be to walk back into that lounge and end his career with 4 sentences about her actual qualifications, her actual decorations, her actual rank. The kind that came from knowing she'd survive his cruelty far better than he'd survive the truth. Instead, she kept her shoulders hunched, kept her eyes down, kept being exactly the person they thought she was. The nervous new nurse. The nursing school baby. The one who didn't belong. Room 304 was her real assignment tonight, and she welcomed the quiet of it like a meditation. Emma Sullivan lay in the hospital bed with the kind of listlessness that spoke volumes to anyone actually listening. 8 years old. Daughter of Commander James Sullivan, the same SEAL officer Katie's own son served under at Coronado Naval Base. Small world. Smaller than anyone here needed to know. Emma's mother sat in the chair beside the bed, reading a magazine with the kind of mechanical attention that meant she wasn't actually seeing the words. Worry had carved new lines into her face in the week and a half she'd been keeping vigil. "How's our Emmy doing tonight?" Katie asked, keeping her voice soft, inflected with the careful sympathy they expected. She moved to the monitors with the fluidity of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The chart said Emma had been admitted 10 days ago with what the attending physician called stress-induced anorexia. 5 different doctors had rotated through the case. Sterling, Chen, Patel, Morrison, and Hughes. All of them had reached the same conclusion. Behavioral. The girl was fine. Just anxious. Just being difficult. Just needed her mother to set better boundaries. Just needed time. They were all wrong. Katie could see it in Emma's lips, the barely perceptible blue tinge that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with something the 5 doctors hadn't bothered to look for. She could see it in the subtle retractions between the ribs. The slightly shallow breathing. The way Emma's eyes tracked Katie's movements with the kind of awareness that came from a body in distress, even if the brain didn't have words for it yet. Katie's hands moved through the vital check with practiced precision, noting the oxygen saturation reading, the heart rate, the subtle signs of compensation. Pain was information. Pain was data. So was the absence of pain masquerading as behavioral problems. "Can we get you anything, sweetheart?" Emma's mother asked, leaning forward with the desperate hope that one of these hospital staff members would finally know what to do. "Emmy's fine," Katie said quietly. "Just resting. I'll check on her in a bit." What she meant was, "I'll be back." What she meant was, "I see you." What she meant was, "Someone here actually knows what's wrong, and it isn't what they told you." She left the room and moved down the hallway toward her locker, the weight of the hidden truth settling into her chest like a second heartbeat. In the locker room at the end of the corridor, surrounded by the hanging uniforms and personal spaces of the day shift nurses, she opened hers and ran her fingers over the pair of worn combat boots at the bottom. The leather was cracked and weathered. The laces were frayed. The tags read Rodriguez SCPO, the letters barely legible from 4 years of deployment, for years of moving through heat and dust and blood and rain. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. That's who she was. That's who she'd always be, no matter what the Pentagon's classified files said, no matter what her new driver's license claimed. These boots had crossed the Euphrates River. They'd walked through the rubble of Fallujah at 0300 hours. They'd stood in a hospital corridor in 2019, exactly 63 seconds before an explosion that supposedly killed her. She'd survived. She was still surviving. She just couldn't tell anyone how. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she could feel something shifting in room 304. Something that the 5 doctors had missed because they weren't trained to see it, because they'd stopped listening to their patients and started trusting their assumptions instead. Emma Sullivan wasn't refusing to eat because of stress. Emma Sullivan's body was beginning to fail, and Katie had exactly 3 days to figure out why before the girl's condition crossed from treatable to critical. She closed her locker and started walking back toward room 304, already running through the differential diagnoses in her mind, already knowing that the moment she found the answer, everything would change. The carefully constructed Katie Rodriguez who worked pediatrics at Sacred Heart and kept her head down and never challenged the doctors would have to disappear. And the person who'd survived Ramadi, who'd saved 11 men from kill zones, who'd earned her Navy Cross in blood and sandstorms would have to emerge. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric song above her head. Down the hallway, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in someone else's room. And Katie Rodriguez moved toward her patient with the kind of purpose that had nothing to do with being nervous and everything to do with being the only person in this hospital who actually understood what was at stake. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum when Dr. Sterling cornered Katie at 6:02 a.m. on her 8th day. 8 physicians clustered around the donut box, attending radiologists, a cardiologist, 2 residents rotating through. Sterling's voice carried the weight of a man used to being the loudest voice in every room. "Gentlemen, I'm taking bets." Sterling didn't even look at Katie as she entered to clock in. $50 says nursing school baby here quits before the month is out. These community college types never last more than 3 weeks. They can't handle the pressure, they can't handle the hours, and they definitely can't handle working under someone who actually knows what competence looks like. Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. A resident Katie didn't recognize, blonde hair, expensive watch, grinned and pulled out his wallet. "I'll take that action, Sterling. I say she makes it to week 4. The third resident laughed harder. "You're both being generous. I give her 10 days. Tops." Katie had trained in Ramadi under fire where shrapnel sang past at 2,400 feet per second. She'd held a sergeant's femoral artery together with her bare hand for 11 minutes while a medevac was inbound. She'd carried a 220-pound Marine through 2 city blocks while insurgent rounds cracked the air around them like applause. But none of that had prepared her for the specific weight of being dismissed by 8 men in pressed white coats while holding a timesheets folder. She took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape down her cheek. Wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. "I don't quit, Doctor." The room went quiet. Not respectful quiet. Predatory quiet. Sterling's smirk deepened. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see how long you last when the real pressure starts." Katie clocked in. 57 minutes until shift change. 57 minutes until she started rounds in the pediatric wing. 57 minutes to forget that 8 men had just placed a bet on her failure like she was a racehorse they were betting against at Del March. The next day arrived with the kind of San Diego heat that made the parking lot shimmer like a mirage. Katie grabbed lunch from the cafeteria at 11:43 a.m., turkey sandwich, apple, 1 container of tomato bisque, and sat alone at a corner table as usual. She'd learned early that eating alone was safer than trying to integrate with the hospital's clique hierarchies. Eating alone meant nobody could watch you miss social cues you didn't know existed. She was on her 3rd bite when Sterling walked past with a tray full of supporters, the same 8 men from yesterday, plus 2 nurses who'd laughed the hardest. Sterling moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd practiced dominance until it became muscle memory. He walked past her table. Slowed. Made eye contact. Then bumped her tray with deliberate precision. The bisque didn't spill gradually. It erupted, a tsunami of tomato and cream splattering across her white scrubs, pooling on the table, dripping onto the floor. Silverware clattering. The plastic bowl spinning. The sandwich sliding into her lap. A dozen colleagues watched. Every eye in the cafeteria pivoted to Katie. Sterling didn't apologize. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds while chaos settled, then looked down at her with the expression of a man who'd just executed a perfect play. Clumsy. His voice carried across the room like a public announcement. Maybe nursing isn't for you after all. Maybe you should stick to something simpler. Community health clinic? Home visits? Something where you won't break things? The laughter started from his entourage first. Then spread like a virus. Katie felt it happen the moment the room decided she was permissible prey. She knelt. Picked up each piece methodically. The silverware first, then the bowl, then the napkin saturated with soup. Her hands were steady as stainless steel. Her breathing unchanged. She said nothing. Did nothing but gather the wreckage of her lunch while 23 staff members watched her kneel on the cafeteria floor like a penitent in a church she'd never attended. When she stood, her scrubs were ruined, a quarter-sized stain spreading across her torso. She would need to change before Emma's noon vital signs check. She would need to walk past Sterling's office to get to the pediatric locker room. She would need to clock back in with 17 minutes less break time than she was entitled to. That afternoon, it happened at 2:14 p.m. outside room 304. Sterling appeared in the hallway with Emma Sullivan's chart folded under his arm like a general carrying battle plans. Katie was documenting morning vitals on the supply cart, Emma's respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, heart rate. Everything elevated. Everything moving in a direction that made Katie's medic brain light up like a sonar ping. Sterling didn't hand her the chart. He threw it. Not aggressively enough to seem assault. Just confidently enough to seem casual. The chart spun once in the air and landed at her feet with a soft thud against linoleum. Emma's name visible on the first tab, Sullivan, Emma Rose. Age 8. DOB the 17th of April, 2016. Patient of Dr. Sterling and 4 others who clearly hadn't looked closely enough. Pick that up, sweetheart. Sterling's voice was pure velvet condescension. Review it and tell me again why you think a SEAL commander's daughter needs anything more than a psychiatrist. Because from my professional medical opinion, she's a healthy 8-year-old girl with anxiety-driven appetite suppression. Not a medical crisis. Just a spoiled child who won't eat because she wants attention from her Navy SEAL daddy. Katie bent. Retrieved the chart. 1 measured breath. 1 tear escaped. The same single tear she'd learned to deploy without losing focus, without losing presence, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her crumble. She wiped it. Raised her eyes to Sterling's face, and something shifted in her posture. Just a millimeter. Just enough. I've carried wounded men twice your weight through Ramadi. Her voice dropped an octave. Not angry. Not shaking. Just lower. I can handle a clipboard, Doctor. Sterling's jaw tightened. The corridor narrowed around them. 3 other staff members froze, a medication tech, a respiratory therapist, a resident reviewing orders at a nearby workstation. They were all watching now. They were all listening. Big talk from a baby nurse. Sterling's voice turned to ice. Stay in your lane, Rodriguez. Some of us actually went to medical school. He turned and walked away, but Katie saw it, the flash in his eyes when she'd said Ramadi. The recognition that landed somewhere between confusion and rage. He'd expected her to stay broken. He'd expected her to stay small. He'd expected her to be the kind of person who cried quietly and never fought back. What he didn't know was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because her body still remembered how to release pressure the way a professional did, cleanly, controlled, without letting the machinery shut down. She spent that night in the hospital library, reviewing Emma's chart with a cup of cold coffee and a focus that felt like coming home after 12 years in exile. 5 doctors. 5 signatures. Sterling, Chen, Patel, Morrison, Hughes. All of them documenting the same conclusion: behavioral food refusal, psychiatric intervention recommended, prognosis good with behavioral modification. But there was something underneath the words. Something they'd all missed because they were looking for the obvious answer, the easy answer, the answer that meant they didn't have to do anything except refer the child to psychology. Emma's breathing patterns were off. Katie had documented her own vitals for 6 days now, every shift, every 4-hour interval. The respiratory rate was climbing. 18 breaths per minute on day 1. 22 on day 3. 26 on day 6. That wasn't anxiety. That was her body failing to do something fundamental. And the chart Sterling had thrown at her feet contained a chest X-ray from 2 days ago. Katie pulled it up on the hospital system, a tiny abnormality in the right lung field marked as insignificant in Sterling's handwriting. He documented it and dismissed it in the same motion, the way you'd brush a speck of dust off your jacket and forget it ever existed. But that speck was telling Katie something her combat training wouldn't let her ignore. That tiny shadow was screaming at her medic brain. Katie filled out the incident report for the cafeteria incident at 11:38 p.m. Documented the time, the date, the witnesses. Included no editorializing. Just the facts: Dr. Sterling's food tray made contact with my lunch, resulting in spillage across my work uniform and the cafeteria floor. I cleaned the area. No injury sustained. She printed it. Filed it. Knew it would disappear into the hospital's complaint system like water disappearing into sand. But that wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was Emma Sullivan breathing at a rate her 8-year-old lungs weren't designed to sustain. What mattered was 5 doctors missing something. What mattered was that Katie Rodriguez, whoever she was now, whoever she'd been allowed to become, could still see what everyone else overlooked. The next morning would bring a 6 a.m. vital sign check on a child who was beginning to fail. The next morning would bring Katie's hands moving on their own, doing the work they'd been trained to do under the worst conditions imaginable. The next morning would bring a choice that would change everything. But for now, at midnight in the hospital library with Emma's chart glowing on the computer screen, Katie Rodriguez touched the worn combat boots in her locker through 1,000 pixels of distance and remembered that some things, some core, unshakable things, never really go away. They just wait. They just watch. They just prepare for the moment when the world needs them to be exactly who they've always been. The days blurred together in a way Katie had learned to recognize during her last deployment to Ramadi, that compression of time where each shift felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. 6 days. 144 hours. She'd taken every additional shift she could volunteer for in room 304, telling herself it was professional diligence, knowing it was something closer to obsession. The combat boots in her locker seemed heavier when she passed them now, as if they were judging her for carrying a different kind of weight. Emma Sullivan lay in the pediatric bed with the hollow composure of a child learning to disappear into her own body. Katie had learned that language too, the dialect of survival spoken by people who'd been told their pain wasn't real. By the 4th day of Katie's unofficial surveillance, she'd established a pattern that would have made her old intelligence briefing officers proud. Every 4 hours, vitals. Every 4 hours, Katie's trained eye cataloging what the 5 attending physicians had collectively missed. Respiratory rate, 42 breaths per minute on day 1. 46 on day 2. 51 by day 4. The upward trajectory was a sentence written in oxygen debt. She documented everything in the margins of her own personal notebook, notes that weren't technically part of the official record, observations that would never hold up in court but held an absolute certainty in her chest that felt like muscle memory. Commander Sullivan had stopped asking her what she was looking for. He'd started recognizing the slight tilt of her head that meant she was listening to something the monitors hadn't yet decided to announce. On the morning of the 6th day, Katie noticed Emma's lips had taken on a shade of blue that didn't belong to any child's face. Cyanosis. The kind that whispered of oxygen molecules running out of places to go. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the corner, machines laboring to do what Emma's own lungs could no longer manage alone. Katie's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd held dying men together in desert sand, who'd learned that hesitation was a luxury only the unwounded could afford. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Emma's thin arm and watched the numbers climb. 98/64. Not emergency numbers yet, but emergency numbers in formation, getting closer with each breath. The child's chest rose and fell with an asymmetry that made Katie's jaw clench, left side moving, right side lagging, as if one lung had already begun its surrender. She pulled up the collective notes from Dr. Sterling, Dr. Chen, Dr. Patel, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Hughes in the electronic system. 5 attending physicians. 15 years of combined experience. Infinite credentials and conference lectures and peer-reviewed publications. And they had all arrived at the same diagnosis with the kind of certainty that only came from not actually looking. Behavioral. Anxiety. Refusal to eat stemming from psychological distress related to hospitalization. The language of doctors who had already decided what they were seeing before they'd looked at the patient. Katie had seen this before in Fallujah, in the tactical briefs where certainty destroyed more soldiers than bullets ever could. The decreased breath sounds on the right side, Dr. Sterling had documented it as mild bilateral adventitious sounds, likely anxiety-related. Dr. Chen had noted it and moved on to baseline labs. The percussion dullness that should have screamed something is wrong here had been absorbed into a narrative of a scared 8-year-old girl who just needed time to adjust. But Katie heard what they hadn't bothered to listen for. The absence of sound. The space where air should be moving and wasn't. The trapped air in Emma's pleural cavity, pressing against her lung like a fist slowly closing. Tension pneumothorax. The words formed in Katie's mind with the clarity of a mission briefing. Air trapped in the chest cavity. The lung collapsing inward. Pressure building. Each breath getting harder because the mechanics had been broken and nobody had bothered to fix them before it became an emergency. Not yet an emergency, still in that window where it could be stopped, but only if someone actually saw it. Katie looked at Commander Sullivan through the window of room 304, at the man who'd been standing vigil over his daughter's bed for 18 hours because SEALs don't trust machines to do their own reconnaissance. "Commander." Her voice came out steady, the deferential tone still in place like a borrowed coat she wore to fit into this hospital world. "I need to speak with you. About Emma's chest X-ray. About what the 5 doctors have documented and what they haven't actually looked at." Sullivan's eyes came up from his daughter's face with the speed of a weapon system cycling to target. "Tell me. Your daughter has a developing tension pneumothorax." The clinical terminology felt like armor, like speaking in a language that made the truth irrefutable. Air is trapped in her pleural cavity, between her lung and her chest wall. The pressure is collapsing her right lung. Every breath makes it worse because there's less space for air to go, and the trapped air pushes harder against the collapsed lung. That's why she can't eat. That's why her oxygen saturation is falling. It's not anxiety. It's physics. She watched the color drain from Commander Sullivan's face in the way she'd learned to recognize in field hospitals, the moment when a man understood that someone he loved was running out of time. "How long?" His voice had dropped into the register she recognized. The combat voice. The decision-making voice. "Minutes, not hours. The pneumothorax is small now, but it's expanding. If we don't decompress it, the pressure will tamponade her heart." Katie's hands were steady at her sides, but her heart was moving like a hummingbird in a cage. "I need to perform an emergency needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I'm calling it in, but I need your permission as her parent to proceed." "Do it." Sullivan didn't hesitate. Didn't ask for credentials. Didn't question whether a 4-week-old nurse had any right to make decisions that attending physicians had already rejected. He saw what he needed to see, and that was all the authorization Katie required. She paged Sterling's stat and moved toward the crash cart with the economy of motion that came from muscle memory. The charge nurse understood without being told, just watched Katie's trajectory and started prepping the equipment, draping the sterile field, understanding that sometimes you recognized authority not by title but by the absolute certainty of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions before and survived them. Katie's hand selected the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the precision of selecting a weapon. Not with fear. Not with doubt. With the simple mechanical knowledge of what was required. Sterling appeared in the doorway for minutes later, annoyed the way powerful men get annoyed when their schedules are interrupted. "What's the emergency, Rodriguez?" His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to never being questioned. "Her oxygen saturation is dropping. Breath sounds are absent on the right side. Cyanosis present. Asymmetrical chest wall movement. She needs immediate decompression." He glanced at the monitor with the casual dismissal of a man who'd already decided what he was seeing. Emma's oxygen saturation read 88% and falling. Her SATs are 88. She's anxious. Give her oxygen and step back. The words came out like a dismissal, like a door closing on something Katie was trying to keep open. Katie didn't move. "Doctor, she needs immediate." "I said step back." Sterling's voice hardened into the tone of absolute institutional authority. "You're a nurse with 4 weeks' experience questioning 5 attending physicians. Get out of this room before I write you up." The silence that followed was the silence of a choice being made. Katie could feel it in the air like the moment before a raid commenced, when everything hinged on the next decision, when you either committed or you retreated and lived with the knowing. She took one measured breath. Looked at Emma, small in the bed, struggling for air that came harder with each second. Looked at Commander Sullivan, who was watching her with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself, the expression of a man deciding whether to trust his gut over his orders. Katie made the choice. "With respect, Doctor, I'm performing the procedure." Her hands moved on their own. The prepped site. The antiseptic. The needle finding the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the precise anatomical landmark where air could be released and a collapsed lung could breathe again. Sterling's face went crimson like a warning light, all his institutional power suddenly powerless against the simple physics of a needle and someone willing to be destroyed by it. "If you touch that patient, you're fired." Katie met his eyes. The needle punctured through skin and muscle and pleura. The hiss of air escaping, that perfect sound of pressure being released, of a system coming back into balance. Emma gasped. Color flooded back into her small face like someone turning up a dimmer switch. Oxygen saturation climbed, 92. 95. 98. Breath sounds returned to the right lung like a miracle that was just physics working the way it was supposed to if anyone had bothered to actually look. "Then fire me." Katie's voice came out steady as a sniper scope. Sterling stood frozen, watching his authority become irrelevant, watching a 4-week-old nurse with worn combat boots in her locker save a child's life in 90 seconds while 5 attending physicians had chosen their certainty over her observation. He stepped backward like he was disappearing. "You just ended your career." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Emma breathing. The worst part was Commander Sullivan's exhale, the release of a father who'd been trained his entire life to trust his own eyes, and had finally done it. Emma's lips were barely moving when Katie entered room 304. The child's breathing had become shallow, almost apologetic, each inhalation requiring effort that no 8-year-old should need to muster. Katie had been watching for 6 days. She documented everything, the subtle blue tinge creeping into Emma's fingernail beds, the way the girl's shoulders rose and fell with each labored breath, the diminishing oxygen saturation that the monitors displayed in cold red numbers. 88%. 85%. 82. The 5 doctors had missed it. Dr. Sterling, Dr. Chen, Dr. Patel, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Hughes, all of them had looked at the same child, seen the same vital signs, and decided the problem was psychological. A behavioral issue. Anxiety about eating. But Katie had held trauma patients whose bodies screamed in languages most people never learned. Pain is data. She could read Emma's body like a textbook written in blood and oxygen starvation. The child's eyes found hers as Katie moved to the bed. No words. Katie's hands had already memorized the procedure during a night shift, muscle memory from decades of field medicine taking control before her conscious mind could second-guess itself. She positioned her fingers at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Found the spot. Felt the tissue yield beneath her palm. This was technically outside her scope. A registered nurse was not supposed to perform needle decompression. The thought lasted exactly 1 second. Then Emma's oxygen sat dropped to 79%, and the thought evaporated like sweat under a desert sun. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was already in her other hand. Katie had retrieved it 3 minutes ago, when Sterling had refused her assessment with the casual dismissal of a man who'd never been wrong in his own mind. She'd walked to the supply room, removed the needle, and carried it back inside her scrub pocket like a secret. Now she positioned it perpendicular to the child's chest wall, angled slightly toward the feet to avoid the vessels running along the rib, and pressed forward with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this before, in places where hesitation meant body bags. The needle slid through skin, muscle, the pleural membrane. Then came the sound, the hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung cavity finally finding relief, the distinctive whisper of pressure equalizing. The sound of a child getting her life back. "Stay with me, Emilia," Katie whispered, though her voice didn't waver. Steady as a surgical laser. She secured the angiocath in place, positioned the catheter, and watched the monitor with the intensity of a sniper reading wind. 82. 85. 88. 91. The numbers climbed like a prayer being answered. Emma's breathing deepened. Color began returning to her lips. The oxygen saturation stopped its downward march and reversed course, 94%, 96%, 98. Normal. Alive. The kind of normal that 9 out of 10 physicians in this hospital wouldn't have known was drowning. 90 seconds. That was all it took. Katie had saved Emma Sullivan's life in less time than it took to microwave coffee, and in doing so, she had just created the wound that would nearly destroy her own. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Dr. Sterling arrived at room 304 minutes later, paged by the respiratory therapist, only to find Katie standing beside a child whose vitals had stabilized into the green zone. Sterling's face went through 3 distinct phases of color, first confusion, then rage, then a smile that looked like a predator realizing it had been challenged. He'd said nothing. He'd simply stared at Katie with the expression of a man calculating how to use this moment, how to transform a life-saving procedure into a liability. Then he walked out of the room, and Katie understood with crystalline clarity that she had just won a battle but set herself up for a war she couldn't win with a stethoscope and compassion. By 2:11 p.m. that same day, Katie's badge had been deactivated. By 3:15 p.m., her locker was being cleared by security. The chain of events moved with the terrible inevitability of dominoes falling in slow motion, each piece knocking the next into destruction before there was any chance to catch them. Dr. Sterling had made 4 phone calls. The first was to the chief of medicine, delivered in the measured tone of a physician expressing grave concerns about liability. A nurse with barely a month's experience just performed a procedure outside her scope of practice, he'd said. A procedure that should have been ordered by an attending physician. She undermined 5 separate diagnoses by 5 separate doctors. We have significant exposure here. The chief of medicine listened. The chief of medicine worried about lawsuits the way most people worried about breathing. It was constant, automatic, and could stop at any moment. The second call went to 3 board members Sterling golfed with on alternate weekends. Men with money, with influence, with the kind of institutional weight that could push a single nurse through the hospital's credentialing machinery like a grain of sand through a sieve. The third call had been to Sacred Heart's credentialing office. I need Katie Rodriguez's original nursing school transcripts re-verified, Sterling had said. His tone was casual. Professional. The kind of tone that made the request sound routine rather than like a hunter checking if his traps had been set correctly. I have some concerns about her background. I'd like them documented. The credentialing office had obliged. They always did. The fourth call went to the fabricated references Katie had used to build her new identity. A nursing school in Tucson that didn't quite exist, the number leading to a disconnected line. An administrator at a community college in Arizona who, when reached, had no record of anyone named Katie Rodriguez completing their nursing assistant certification. Just like that, the entire structure of her civilian life, the credential that had taken her 4 weeks to establish, began to crumble in reverse, as if someone had hit play on a recording of its construction in backwards mode. An external investigator had arrived by 10:36 a.m. the next morning, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who'd spent 20 years looking for inconsistencies in people's stories. She'd reviewed Katie's application line by line. Found the discrepancies immediately. The gaps. The dates that didn't quite line up. The references that couldn't be reached. By noon, she'd flagged everything in the system and recommended immediate suspension pending full investigation. The HR director had called Katie into her office at 2:51 p.m. The woman's name was Patricia Summers, and she slid a single page across her desk with the careful precision of someone serving divorce papers. Suspended pending investigation, she'd read aloud, as if the written words needed audible translation to be understood. Credential irregularities flagged. Performing procedures outside scope of practice. Badge deactivated effective immediately. You're not to return to the floor pending completion of the investigation. Patricia wouldn't look at her. The professional courtesy of not witnessing the exact moment a person's life came apart at the seams. Security had walked her to her locker. The guard, Marcus, the one who'd smiled at her every morning for 4 weeks, asked about her son, held the door when her hands were full, wouldn't meet her eyes now. He stood 3 feet away while Katie opened the grey metal locker and looked at the space that had held her civilian identity like a temporary reliquary. Her extra scrubs. A photo of Miguel. And at the bottom, dusty from 4 years of being carried in that locker like a prisoner carries a memory of the world before prison, the pair of worn combat boots. Tan leather, scuffed at the toes, the laces still tied in the double knot she'd learned in basic training. She'd kept them because they were the only thing she'd been allowed to remove from the Naval Amphibious Base at Coronado on the day the Pentagon had erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez from every database, every file, every official record. The day after the operation in Fallujah had gone black, the day her old life had been classified so thoroughly that even she wasn't supposed to acknowledge it had ever existed. Katie lifted the boots out of the locker and held them against her chest. They smelled like diesel fuel and dust and old leather and home, the kind of home that didn't exist on any map. Marcus handed her a cardboard box. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. Katie set the boots in the box carefully, on top of her folded scrubs, and walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital still wearing the uniform of a nurse who no longer had credentials. The drive home took 17 minutes. Katie knew because she watched the clock. Watched it the way a drowning person watches the surface of the water getting farther away. She sat in the parking lot of her apartment complex for 4 minutes before getting out, her hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the strangeness of sitting in a car on a Wednesday at 2:33 p.m. when she should have been in room 304, checking vitals, making sure Emma Sullivan was breathing without effort. Miguel was in the kitchen when she opened the door. Her son, Petty Officer Second Class Miguel Rodriguez, 22 years old, on leave from his deployment with SEAL Team 3 at Coronado, still in the phase of military service where the certainty of his training hadn't yet been worn smooth by reality. He'd been making a sandwich, turkey and provolone and mustard, the mundane luxury of a young man whose biggest decision today had been what to eat for lunch. When he saw her standing in the doorway, still in scrubs, still stained with the ordinary detritus of hospital work, face probably showing exactly what a woman looked like when her entire civilian existence had just been suspended pending investigation, something shifted in his expression. Not confusion yet. Just the beginning of it. "Mom? Why are you home?" Miguel set down his sandwich. His voice had the note of someone who'd just realized something wasn't as safe as they'd believed. Katie moved to the kitchen table and sat down. Set the cardboard box on the surface, carefully, as if it contained something that could detonate if handled wrong. Which it did. Her fingers found the edge of the combat boots and traced the familiar worn leather. The muscle memory was older than her voice. Older than language. Her hands remembered what her life had been before this quiet kitchen, before the pretense of being just a nurse, before 4 years of hiding. Katie started. But what could she say? That she'd saved Commander Sullivan's daughter and it had exposed her as too competent, too capable, too much everything a junior nurse should never be? That the very thing that should have made her irreplaceable had instead made her impossible? That she couldn't explain the truth without destroying Miguel's belief in the life she'd built, the stable normal she'd fought so hard to create for him? The tears came before she could stop them. Not the controlled release from the staff lounge where she'd let one tear escape and maintained eye contact with Dr. Sterling. Not the managed display of human emotion. These were the real ones. The ones that came from 4 years of holding everything together, the fear, the displacement, the constant background hum of knowing that her entire existence was built on a foundation of lies necessary for survival. These were the tears of a woman who'd survived 2 tours of combat, a black operation, deliberate erasure by the military she'd served, and still managed to smile while serving juice to patients in a hospital cafeteria. And these tears were what broke her. Miguel didn't speak. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, reached out, and took her hand. His palm was calloused from weapons handling, from climbing ropes, from the work of being a Navy SEAL in training. Familiar. "Mom, you've never missed a shift," Miguel said quietly. "You taught me Rodriguez women finish what they start." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Katie understood that he'd just seen something he'd never seen before, his mother, the unstoppable force, the woman who'd raised him alone and never shown weakness, finally breaking. Katie couldn't explain. Not yet. Not while the investigation was pending, not while revealing her true identity would violate every condition of her protected status. She just squeezed his hand and let him sit there in the kitchen with her while the afternoon light shifted across the table and the weight of her past, her present, and her impossible future pressed down on both of them with the force of something that couldn't be lifted by a single pair of hands, no matter how trained those hands were. That evening, after Katie had gone to bed, Miguel made a phone call. He'd found the number in his unit roster, the one he kept secure, the one for commanding officers who needed to be reached for emergencies. He waited until the line answered. "I need to speak with Commander Sullivan," he said quietly. "It's about my mother." The rotor wash hit like a physical force. Two Black Hawks descended through the morning fog, their blades cutting the San Diego sky into pieces as Sacred Heart's windows rattled in their frames. 8 o'clock. 0800 hours. The sound was unmistakable, that deep mechanical thunder that Katie had heard 1,000 times before, in another life, in dust-covered valleys where the noise meant extraction or reinforcement or sometimes just the end of everything quiet. She was folding a discharge summary when the vibration ran through the building's spine. Her hand stilled. She didn't look up. But every muscle in her body knew that sound. The young nurses around her froze, confused. Helicopter landings at a civilian hospital weren't unusual, but the rotor wash from two aircraft, simultaneous descent, that particular precision of approach, that wasn't medevac protocol. That was tactical insertion. Katie kept her eyes on the paperwork. Composure. The boots were still in her locker, 147 feet away down the eastern corridor. She'd considered retrieving them this morning. She hadn't. Timing mattered. The rotors powered down in sequence. The silence that followed felt like pressure building in her ears. She set the pen on the counter with deliberate slowness. 1, 2, 3 breaths. Then she stood, moved toward the main entrance with no apparent urgency, just another nurse checking the commotion like everyone else was checking it. Through the glass doors, she saw them coming. For figures in full tactical gear, body armor the color of wet concrete, rifles held low ready, boots synchronized like they shared a single nervous system. They moved through the lobby with the fluid precision of operators who'd cleared 1,000 rooms and meant to clear 1,000 more. The front desk staff scattered instinctively, the way people do when apex predators walk past them without making eye contact. The team leader, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse things than this, stepped up to the reception desk. His voice was quiet. Voices like that didn't need volume. They had gravity. "Senior Chief Rodriguez," he said. "Not a question. A summons. We need to find her. Now." The receptionist's face went pale. She looked at her colleague. They looked at each other like someone had just asked them to produce a ghost. Katie felt the moment stretch. The other nurses in the corridor felt it too, that sudden thickness in the air, the way it changes when military authority enters a civilian space. She walked toward the lobby. Not quickly. Not slowly. The way someone moves who knows exactly where they're supposed to be and exactly why. The team leader's eyes found her before she reached the desk. His gaze was like a scanner, assessing in a single sweep, posture, gait, the way her hand stayed steady, the fact that she wasn't surprised. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Recognition. He'd been briefed on something most of these people weren't briefed on. "Senior Chief Rodriguez," he said again, and this time it wasn't a question looking for confirmation. It was an acknowledgement of a fact that had just walked into the room. Katie stopped for feet from him. Behind him, the other 3 SEALs were already scanning the perimeter, establishing security. One of them had his hand near his rifle sling. Protocol. They didn't know if she was compromised, if this needed to be an extraction or a rescue or something else entirely. The hospital's chief of medicine emerged from his office, bewildered, starting to ask questions he had no authority to ask. And then Commander James Sullivan stepped forward from behind the tactical team. He wore civilian clothes, polo shirt, slacks, but there was nothing civilian about him. The way he carried himself, the scar along his jawline, the eyes that had seen too much and decided to see more anyway. He was older than Katie remembered, but people aged differently after they'd held their child's bleeding hand and watched her refuse to eat for days while doctors called it behavioral. "Senior Chief Petty Officer," he said. The words hung in the air like a salute. Katie's voice came out steady. Measured. The voice of someone giving a sitrep, not asking for permission. Commander. The hospital's chief of medicine stepped forward. What is the meaning of this? Who are these people? I need to know what's happening in my hospital. Sir, one of the SEALs said quietly, gesturing toward the administrative office. It wasn't hostile. It was just the acknowledgement of rank structure that didn't bend for civilian titles. The chief of medicine, to his credit, recognized it. He stepped back. Commander Sullivan moved closer to Katie. Your file is being unsealed. Current authorization, Pentagon level. The director wants to meet with you this week. But there are some things the team needs to see first. He nodded toward his office, the administrator's office, commandeered by the SEALs with nothing more than a look. In private. The head nurse appeared in the doorway of the administrative office, trembling visibly. She was holding a file folder, a thick one, older, with the kind of stamps and redactions that only existed in classified documents. Her hand shook as she opened it. The first page had Katie's name and a photograph from 14 years ago. The second page listed operations, Ramadi, 2012 to 2014. Fallujah, 2015 to 2017. The dates aligned with years Katie supposedly didn't have. Years that had been erased from every database, every record, every official acknowledgement of her existence. The head nurse's voice trembled. 2 tours. Ramadi and Fallujah. She turned the page. Navy Cross. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Another page. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. She couldn't seem to keep reading, but Commander Sullivan was already there, taking the file from her, his expression hardening with each page. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His voice had that quality again, the kind that didn't need volume because every word carried weight. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez was ordered to disappear after a classified operation in 2019. The official record states that she died in a hospital bombing in Kandahar. Protected status. New identity. Deep cover. The seal on this file was a level above normal protocol, presidential order level. Katie felt the weight of those words, the specific gravity of them. 14 years of erasure. 4 years of nursing school under a civilian name. 3 weeks of humiliation from a man who would have spit on her boots if he'd known who wore them. The chief of medicine stood frozen. The head nurse sat down slowly. Around the hospital, nurses and orderlies had stopped moving, stopped working, frozen in the moment of understanding that something fundamental about reality had just shifted. That's when the security guard appeared beside Dr. Sterling, who had emerged from his office when the SEALs arrived. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper, white, thin, translucent. He looked like he might dissolve if anyone touched him. The security guard held an empty cardboard box. The same box he'd given Katie 6 days ago, filled with her personal belongings. The security guard looked at Sterling with eyes that had seen the full scope of what he'd done, the depths of the mistake he'd made. When he spoke, his voice was polite. Neutral. Which somehow made it worse. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at the file in Commander Sullivan's hands, at the SEAL team leader, at Katie standing with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, at the photograph of himself in that file, the image of a man who had spent 14 years bullying, dismissing, and nearly killing the decorated combat veteran he'd been professionally assaulting since her first shift. The box felt heavier in the security guard's hands than it had when Katie held it. Sterling moved toward his office to gather his things. The walk took 47 seconds. Every step of it felt like it lasted longer than his entire career. The rest happened in the kind of official silence that doesn't have sound but still fills a room. The chief of medicine excused himself to call the hospital's legal team. The head nurse disappeared into her office and didn't emerge for 3 hours. The SEAL team leader stood in the administrative office with Commander Sullivan and Katie, confirming details, establishing that she would be released from her immediate suspension, that her nursing license would be fully cleared, that certain documentation would be processed through channels that didn't require explanation. 6 months later, Katie stood in the Pentagon's Grand Ballroom wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 4 years. The Navy had spent those 6 months conducting an inquiry into how a decorated senior chief petty officer had been allowed to work in a civilian hospital for 3 weeks, being humiliated by administrators with a fraction of her training and none of her experience. The recommendations included retraining initiatives, policy overhauls, and the permanent revocation of Dr. Sterling's medical license across the naval medical system. But that wasn't why Katie was here. Emma Sullivan stood on a small platform, reaching up on her toes to thread the commendation ribbon around Katie's neck. The child was healthy now, thriving was the word they kept using, and it was right. She was eating everything, talking constantly, asking questions about why aunts got special Navy uniforms and whether she could have a uniform too. There was a light in her eyes that had been absent in room 304, the light of a child who had been brought back from the edge of being gone. Katie's son Miguel stood in dress whites, his seal trident gleaming on his chest. He'd gotten the call 6 months ago, the call that meant his mother was cleared, was alive in an official sense, was coming back from the dead in the way that protected personnel sometimes did. He'd cried when he heard her voice on that secure line. She hadn't heard him cry since he was 8 years old. The Rear Admiral who performed the ceremony read the citation for extraordinary medical service in combat environments and continued excellence in emergency medicine, for upholding the highest standards of patient care in the face of institutional pressure, for exemplifying the values of honor, courage, and commitment. When Emma finished threading the ribbon, Katie reached down and pulled her into a brief hug. Professional. Appropriate. But her eyes shone. Miguel saluted his mother. Senior Chief. His voice cracked on the second word, but he held the salute until she returned it. Commander Sullivan approached after the official portion ended. His daughter held his hand, swinging it between them, asking if she could get ice cream now. He smiled, the smile of a man whose child was alive, whose warrior had been vindicated, whose world had realigned back to something like justice. My daughter is alive because you trusted your training over institutional pressure, he said to Katie. Thank you, Senior Chief. Katie returned the salute with precision. Privileged to serve, Commander. The ceremony ended. The photos were taken. The official acknowledgements were made. And in the months that followed, Katie Rodriguez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy SEAL Medic, decorated combat veteran, returned to Sacred Heart Hospital not as a suspended nurse but as Director of Emergency Medical Training. She kept the combat boots in her office, on a shelf where the morning light caught them. New generations of nurses rotated through her program. She taught them about a child in room 304 who couldn't eat because 5 doctors had missed a diagnosis that a young nurse had seen with clarity born of 6 years in Ramadi and Fallujah. She taught them that institution and hierarchy are not the same as truth. That sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous because they've already survived things that would break other people. That speaking up, even when every system tells you to stay silent, is what separates medicine from theater. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification to teenagers at a community college in El Cajon now. They said he was efficient, thorough. But his hands trembled slightly when he demonstrated chest compressions. Once, a student asked why he seemed so sad when he was explaining the importance of early intervention. Sterling didn't answer. He just moved on to the next technique. Katie's story had become institutional knowledge at Sacred Heart. Not legend, that would have been disrespectful to the reality of it. But understanding. When a junior nurse spoke up about something her senior physicians had dismissed, the attendings listened now. Because they'd learned what it cost to have someone who was right stay quiet. And every few days, when Katie was in her office reviewing shift schedules or training materials, a Black Hawk would pass overhead toward Coronado. She'd pause. She'd listen to those rotors cutting the sky. She'd remember the sound of them landing, the weight of erasure lifting, the moment when truth became institutional fact. The boots sat on the shelf, worn leather catching morning light, keeping their secrets and telling their story all at once. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If Katie's journey through institutional betrayal and unexpected vindication resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, we want to hear your story. Subscribe to this channel for more documentaries of hidden heroism, of quiet warriors, of the moments when the truth finally surfaces. Like this video if you believe people deserve to be truly seen for who they are. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been misjudged by someone in authority? What happened when the truth came out? Thank you for watching.